So I'm going to speak about the sex offender registry. It's one of the things that we do here every day. It's an essential tool that we use for any business that is going to be working with youth, children, the elderly, disabled, anyone that's working with the public on a regular basis. You're going to want to run the sex offender database to make sure that they're consumers, clients, whoever you're doing searches on are going to be as safe as they possibly can be. A little background on the sex offender registry. In 1938, the Los Angeles Police Department established its Bureau of Sex Offenses. They kept fingerprints and photographs for those who were convicted of sexual offenses. It wasn't until 1945 that the next state, California, passed the nation's first sex offender registration law in order to give police departments a way to track the known offenders. And then in 1990, Washington State became the first to establish a sexual predator law and established a registry. It's a system for community notification. It established indefinite sentencing and created a tiered system of perceived risk. The sex offender registries online started in 1994 with the Jacob Wetterling Act. Using the Jacob Wetterling Act, they created a registry of convicted offenders that were charged with offenses against children. It did several things. It established a baseline of standards for states to register sex offenders. It created a heightened class of offenders known as sexually violent predators, or SVPs. It required that they verify their address every 90 days for those that were designated as sexually violent predators, and annually for all of their offenders. They also created the first set of federal procedures for notifying the public to anyone who had been convicted of a sex offense. And then in 1996, they introduced Megan's Law, which was an amendment to the Jacob Wetterling Act. And the Megan's Law was used to implement a registration and community notification laws for each state until 1990. Well, they had until the end of 1997 to register everyone for each state. Kind of gave them like a final timeline for when they had to have the registration completed by. Prior to this Megan's Law, only 5 states required sex offenders to register with law enforcement at all. So took a while, but finally everyone got registered. The National Sex Offender Registry, which is one that I personally do, was started in addition to Megan's Law, and it was started with the Adam Walsh Act in 2006, and it created a national sex offender registry, and also created the Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act, which we call SORNA, S-O-R-N-A. Prior to SORNA, states had the individual discretion to decide between who was considered a high risk and a low risk. And it was pretty much based on which offenses the offender had made. So they had their own discretion to decide instead of being on a federal level. And the U.S. Department of Justice is who oversees the National Sex Offender Registry. It's not overseen by the federal branch, it's just the Department of Justice. So the states themselves have a grace period in and of themselves to update the registry on their own. They're required to update it. And once that information has been updated, they have to insert that information into SORNA, the sex offense registry, so that everyone in the public would be able to access that information. The sex offender registry, the national search, is a very broad search. We start out by searching by a person's first name and last name, and anyone in all the 50 states, territories would fall into that search that has a matching name or possibly a pseudonym that is within that first name, last name. So if we were to search for Will and a last name, anyone that would go by Will or William will pop up in that search, and then we will narrow it down based on the person's personal information, whether it be date of birth, the person's address, their, let's see, what else do we use? The middle initials, anything that we can use of their personal information to narrow down until we find the person that is actually the subject we're searching for. The broad search is useful as a tool because we're able to do such an extensive search through all 50 states. It is possible to go to another state and commit a crime and not be registered in that state as a someone who lives in that state. So the national database made it much more complicated for people to do so. So we do that search here, and it is a very broad one. When we do find something that would come back from a different state, like say our subject says they only lived in New York, and we do a search and we come back with the results from somewhere like Puerto Rico, we can then go through the territory of Puerto Rico, I'm not sure if it's a territory or province off the top of my head right now, but we would go through the procedures for Puerto Rico, and we would go to the state level to find more precise information as to what the tier and the safety level of that person is. And at that point, we would switch over to the statewide searches, which Kayla knows all about the statewide searches.
So in regards to New York State, the New York State Sex Offender Registration Act took effect on January 21st, 1996, and it's run by the New York State Division of Criminal Justice, or the DCJS. When a person is convicted of a sexual offense in New York State, they are given a risk level. Now there's 3 types of risk levels. A level 1, which is a low risk offender. They are required to register with the DCJS for 20 years. A level 2, which is a moderate risk. They must register for life. And a level 3, which is a high risk, and they too must register for life, but these individuals are also considered a threat to public safety. Risk levels are determined by the court's assessment regarding whether the person in question is likely to repeat the offense and the danger that they pose to the community. Information about level 2 and 3 offenders is publicly available. However, information about level 1 offenders and offenders whose risk levels are yet to be determined, that is not publicly available. So we here at CI are able to make contact with the DCJS and inquire about information such as risk level, the offense committed, the victim, any special conditions or designations. The courts give designations to individuals, as Josh said earlier. One is a sexually violent offender. There are others such as a sexual predator or a predicate sex offender. Now, if an offender receives a designation, they're required to register with the DCJS for life, regardless of their risk level. The New York State Sex Offender Registry Act does not restrict where an offender may live. However, if an offender is under parole or probation, they may be prohibited from living within 1,000 feet of a school or other facility that cares for children. Those registered with the New York State Sex Offender Registry are required to do a couple of things, such as annually report where they are living and submit updated photos, as Josh said earlier. They're required to do that every 3 years. However, level 3 offenders and those designated sexual predators must confirm their address every 90 days, and they must submit updated photos annually rather than every 3 years. Offenders must notify the DCJS in writing of any new address within 10 days, along with any higher education that they may be attending. Any changes to their status in education also must be reported within 10 days of that change. The DCJS must be notified of any employer name and address information, and they are to provide the names of internet service providers, screen names, and email accounts. So here at CI, we recommend doing both of those searches. The National Sex Offender Registry does not tell the level of offense, only that the individual is registered. Now, the State Sex Offender Registry is the only place to get the level of the offender.